Hi everybody, and thank you ever so much for joining me today. I'm here to talk to you about improving the crime service through process redesign. My name's Jane Gardner and I am the service owner at HMCTS, service owner for crime reform. And the reason I wanted to talk to you today about process redesign is that if you know anything about crime reform at HMCTS, you've probably heard of the Common Platform and other technological changes that we're making, which I talked about yesterday if you were able to join me. Crime reform, in fact, any sort of reform only works and is only successful if you consider processes and people and technology together, technology being the enabler for the processes that the people follow. And so it's really important to us that we reflect that in everything that we do. And we do a lot of work around process redesign and making sure that our processes are fit for purpose. So I thought it'd be really interesting to talk you through that today. So as I mentioned briefly on my presentation yesterday, if you were there, so I won't spend much time on this, the reason we are reforming the crime service is that we consider the current system to be designed around our experts rather than our citizens that we serve. We rely on paper-based systems and poor IT infrastructure. We've got processes that are no longer fit for purpose, hard to administer and hard to navigate and hard to understand for users. And our resource and time allocation doesn't reflect the work being done. So what we mean by that is that simple tasks take a lot of time. So for that reason, we decided to reform the crime service alongside many of our other jurisdictions, intending to make it more robust and flexible, transforming the way we work and delivering efficiency and effectiveness. And we want to achieve that by improving and automating our business processes. And obviously, when we talk about automating, there's a lot of technology there, but we have to get the processes right first before we can enable that with technology. Sharing data and information, again, that's enabled by technology, but processes behind that have to be robust. Enabling new ways of managing business processes, moving to structured data and away from document images, eliminating rekeying and duplicating information, and driving a joined up, standardized and simplified way of working to improve efficiency. So as you'll see, there's a lot of technology in there, but technology alone won't fix the problems that we're trying to fix. We have to improve our processes in order to make sure that that enabler does its job. So we've got a number of design principles on the programme. Some of those are fundamental to everything we do, such as preserving judicial independence, improving engagement of public users in the system, but there are some specific to process improvement. So, for example, the process around working with others to provide better guidance, signposting and access to services, developing common processes across the criminal justice system, developing processes such that criminal cases are clearly part of a common national model with variations only where essential. And that's one of the key challenges where we have a great deal of courts across the country and a number of users trying to create that kind of flex within a framework so that we've got the framework in place so that we know our processes are efficient, but local variations are there where they need to be. So that's a real challenge for us to get our heads around. So our users are varied, as you can see from this slide, varying from judiciary, witnesses, victims, defendants, youth. So it's really important to us that we understand the needs of all of our users, and those differ greatly. And so we have different approaches to how we work with those different users. So, for example, we have a judicial working group which meets very frequently to work through our processes and make sure that they are fit for purpose, both for the judiciary, but also the judiciary have a really useful insight into other users. We also have some judicial engagement groups, so specifically for magistrates courts and for Crown courts, and getting into the detail there of the needs of those different jurisdictions. We second operational staff to the programme, so we have, for example, business product owners who are seconded from operations. Some of them still work part-time in operations to keep their knowledge up to date. We send our staff from the programme to courts regularly to make sure that they're embedded and they understand exactly what the issues are that are being dealt with in the courtrooms and in the court offices. We have user researchers helping us with the programme to go out and talk to users to understand their needs. We have a defence practitioner working group where we have members of the defence practice coming to us and talking to us about some of the processes that we're designing and helping us to understand how we could improve those to make them work better for those individuals. We collaborate in partnership with the CPS in everything that we do, and we talk to them a lot about our business processes to make sure that they're aligned and that again the CPS bring really useful insight about other users as well, so that's really helpful. We regularly engage with other stakeholders about our processes, so for example the probation service, the prison service, making sure that their needs are understood and that their business processes are recognised and reflected in the end-to-end process that we develop. We set up specific working groups, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and we validate our designs once we've finalised them with our users to make sure that we've interpreted the needs properly and correctly, and so that we don't go off to implement something that isn't quite right. Once we have implemented and rolled out into a model court or a test court to try things out, we then get lots of feedback from people using the processes to help us modify and make those fit for purpose. And we have engagement events like this where we get really useful feedback from members of the public about what we could do differently. And I'm really hoping that, that if you do have any feedback for us, you'll share that with us today or get in touch as a result of this presentation. So one of the ways we get input from operational staff is through what we call the Crime Operations Forum, or the Crime Ops Forum as we call it. That's a group of members of staff from across the country, across the different jurisdictions, who come together every 2 weeks with the crime reform programme and Crime Life Services, so the counterpart team in crime who deal with kind of business as usual issues. We meet every 2 weeks to talk through some of the problems that we want to fix, some of the initiatives people have identified to drive improvement to the crime service as a whole. And that's a really useful group collectively to talk about some of the problems that are being experienced across the board. And then as an output of that group, we set up working groups who are tasked by the Crime Ops Forum, made up of specialists relevant to that problem that we're trying to fix, who will go away and do some problem definition, understanding what's the problem we're trying to fix, where are we seeing it, what's the data that we can find to identify any of the underlying issues, understanding whether we are seeing the full problem or just a single point of visibility of that problem, and if so, how can we expand our understanding to catch the whole problem so that we can really nail down and identify the cause of that problem so we can start to find solutions for it. So those working groups meet as and when there are problems to be fixed, and the Crime Ops Forum then receives updates from those working groups, and that means because the Crime Ops Forum meets every 2 weeks, we can turn around problem definitions and solutions quite quickly, and then what we do is make recommendations to one of our boards. So for example, the Crime Reform Service Board looks at issues relevant to the crime reform programme, anything that's in scope for that. So recommendations about improving our crime end-to-end process would go to the Crime Reform Service Board, and that board can also task Crime Ops Forum. So if they feel that there's an issue or a barrier to success, they will ask the Crime Ops Forum to investigate that and come up with solutions. And likewise, the Crime Service Board. So that's the board that looks at our performance and live issues in the crime service. And likewise, if they identify issues that they think need to be investigated, they will task the Crime Ops Forum to investigate that and come up with some recommendations to go back to the board about what improvements can be made. So it's a really effective and useful group who are really engaged with making the crime service fit for purpose, not just for each other and for staff, but for our users, because many of these staff are the people who engage with our users in court every day. So they have a really good understanding of the needs of all of our users of the service. And one of the principles that we like to use with the Crime Ops Forum is lean principles, lean working. And at HMCTS, we base our lean working on 5 what we call the common sense principles. So none of this is rocket science, but it's really helpful to have it written down and refer back to as we are reflecting on the problems that we're trying to fix and the process improvements that we're trying to make. So the first one is value, understanding what our customers value and making sure that we understand exactly what it is that our customers need from our process, and that any changes that we make to our processes add value to our customers. Understanding the value stream, so not just collectively what do our customers need from our process, but actually from the flow of the process. How does that work, and what do our customers need from start to finish? So that's kind of the end-to-end view. The flow, so making all of the actions involved, delivering value to our customers continuously, so there are no interruptions, delays or backlogs or bottlenecks, and I'll talk to you in a minute about what the sorts of waste that we identify in our processes, and how we label those so that we can then start to identify them as problems and find solutions to them. The pull, so the demand on the business, understanding why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And something that we talk about a lot at HMCTS is failure demand. So we want the demand on our business to be value demand, not demand fixing errors or resolving issues. So we want our staff to spend the majority of their time dealing with the things that they should be dealing with. So that's really important to us. And perfection. Now, I struggle with this a little bit. I absolutely think that it's what we should be striving for, but continuous improvement sometimes is about not letting the best be the enemy of the good as well. So although we are striving for excellence, the next steps will be kind of incremental and achievable to get us there. So the types of waste, as I talked to you about before, that we use at HMCTS, and I know used elsewhere as well, are split out into different types. So, for example, waiting time. So where we know from a process, because we talk to our staff, that there's a big wait in our process. For example, we send something off to somebody and then spend a lot of time waiting for it to get back. We identify ways that we can eliminate some of that waste by reducing the waiting time. Overproduction, so doing too much of something sooner than needed, is actually a real issue, and making sure that we're actually only doing as much as we need to for each step is really important. Reworking, so this is linked to that failure demand that I talk about. So failing to produce a good quality product first time means duplication and double handling, or doing something more than once. So that's something that we've identified in some of our processes and are doing some problem solving to resolve. So for example, if there are errors in resulting cases, that creates quite a great deal of work and risk, and so we're doing some problem solving around that now. Motion, so unnecessary movement of people, and of course with the number of courtrooms and courts that we have across the country, that's something that we think about a lot, and something that that we think remote hearings will help to solve some of those problems. Because people will be moving around different courts, they will be sat at their desk on a video, particularly prosecutors, able to dial into the different hearings that they're at. Processing, so producing something to a higher standard than we need, and that's again about not letting the best be the enemy of the good. It's about, you know, sometimes good enough is good enough, and we need to then move on to the next thing, not spend a great deal of time producing a high standard product that is actually a higher standard than is needed. That's challenging, a challenging message to send to people, and one that is often struggled with because people want to do the best they can, but if that's at the expense of other activities, then we need to manage that. Inventory, more relevant to kind of factory style process improvements, but having excess products and materials is something that, you know, if you're taking up too much space in offices and in storerooms so that you're struggling to find room to store things, that can be an issue. Not making full use of the skills and experience of team members is always an issue. I think in any organisation, making sure that you're making the most of the people that you've got. And finally, transportation, so unnecessarily movement of things, equipment, tools, things like that. So you'll see that there are some more relevant to the work that we're doing than others, but a really useful way to work through a problem to say, what is it here that we're seeing? Is it that we are trying to over process something? Is it that we've got quite a lot of failure demand and we're doing a lot of rework? And then from that, you can start to narrow down what is the problem, where are we seeing it, what's the data? And another tool that we use is principles of good process design. And again, reference there at the bottom of the screen to failure demand, and making sure that we eliminate that as we design a process. So we like to look at our end-to-end processes and make sure that we are designing them, as I talked about earlier, to flow in an effective and efficient way. We start by understanding the purpose. So what do our service users need from this process, and what management thinking drives the system? So what is the driver for this process? What is it that that we need to be achieving? Measures are really important to us, and there's a lot of data at HMCTS, I'm sure you can imagine. And as we do develop our technology, we get better data, but that means we need to be more clever about how we use it and how we use it to understand the problems that we need to fix. But we do have a great wealth of data, which is incredible for answering some of the questions that we've been posing ourselves and some of the challenges. And understanding if the measures align with the purpose. And that's something that we're doing on the technology side, is are we capturing the sort of information that we need to capture to be able to answer questions about the processes, and whether they're efficient. And that's a really interesting activity. And the point there about counting the right things is really interesting too. So we're doing a lot of work with colleagues across the criminal justice system to make sure we count things in the same way, or where we don't, we understand why. So for example, we would inevitably say that there have been more prosecutions than the CPS say, because the CPS don't do all prosecutions. So we understand that difference in counting rules. But if we were asked how many CPS prosecutions were there this year, we'd like to think that we all had the same number. But because of the way we count things at the moment, we don't always. So that's a really interesting piece of work that's enabled by technology, but is process driven. Then we think about the demand. So understanding the difference between value demand and failure demand, as I mentioned earlier, and the frequency of the demand. And that's a question that we challenge ourselves on a lot. So, okay, this is a big problem. How are we going to fix it? The impact of it is high if we don't get it right, but it only happens 2 or 3 times a year. So could we design a manual process around it? Does it need to be technology? Those sorts of questions. So again, linking that back to the data is really useful. Capability and predictability. So most demand is predictable once we understand our purpose, and particularly in the court system, we find that the demand on us is predictable. We don't have very much unpredictable demand because we have defined in law the sorts of cases that we can receive. So the kind of the edge cases are unusual. So it's then easier for us to understand what's the capacity and capability that we need to respond to the demand that we receive here. We then think about the flow of the process. So that's not just fixing this little bit over here as an isolated incident, but actually we'll do some problem solving, and then we'll reflect on the end-to-end process to make sure that still makes sense and still flows in the way that I described before. Roles, so who needs to do what, essentially making sure that we've got the right people at every level to perform the process, and not just to do the activity, but the right management, the right quality assurance, and all the roles that you need to successfully complete that process. And then understanding the conditions. So why is it that a problem has occurred, for example? So really drilling down, not so much on how we can solve a problem, but what is the problem? Are we sure that's the problem that we need to fix before we start putting the effort into the process redesign? And how can we use the measures, as I've mentioned, to make sure that we really understand that problem before we try to fix it? So this is our process that we use at HMCTS for improving our processes. First one is identifying the current state, and if you're familiar with lean principles, we often think about the Carter model of understanding the current state first, then identifying what the future state needs to look like. So that's our ambition, and then planning incremental implementation for the changes that we need to make. So making sure that we're taking bite-sized manageable steps to get to our ambition, and understand how long it's going to take to get to that ambition. We do a lot of comms in that kind of planning implementation stage, making sure that staff understand what it is that we want them to do differently and why. And then we introduce what we call the standard operating procedure. And we run that for 2 weeks, often in a test court. So I mentioned to you the crime ops forum earlier. So it might be that people involved in the problem solving volunteer to test a new standard operating procedure in their court first. We also have model courts and model offices where more kind of end-to-end process revisions get tested and timed and measured to make sure that we've the word we use is rinsed it. So we've cleaned it of any issues, we've optimized it, we've made sure that we weren't just sitting behind a desk thinking about what we think works best, but we've actually run it through a court for a significant period of time. 2 weeks catches quite a lot, and we've made the improvement that we thought we would make, and we have eliminated the problem that we've identified. And then arguably the most important step is to review that implementation. So what worked, what didn't work, both in terms of the process, but also in terms of the way we implemented it. So we're constantly learning about how we use our model courts, how we use courts to test our processes, what the risks are around doing that, how we can mitigate them. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a couple of checklists that we refer to when we are improving a process. So the first one is our implementation checklist. The first step is probably the most important one. And as you can imagine, a lot of our court staff don't spend time sitting at desks reading emails, reading standard operating procedures, looking at the intranet. So often standard ways of rolling out change to staff don't work in HMCTS. You can't just issue an email with a mandate that says you're now going to follow a new process. So we produce desk aids, so kind of bite-sized summaries of what's to be done differently. We have monitoring sheets so that people can log what they're doing and how they're doing it and what issues have been raised. We make arrangements to do timekeeping for the process, so understanding whether we've made any efficiencies in the new process. We encourage people to talk about the changes in their team meetings, so there are often daily or weekly team meetings, and we make sure that there's enough information provided to managers to talk to their staff about the changes. And then we ask managers to make sure that everybody is following the new standard operating procedure without making any changes to it in those first 2 weeks. So if there are any critical, this doesn't work, we have to do something differently, we stop the test. But if there are improvements that people who are testing it think could be made, we ask them not to implement those straight away, but just to give it its 2 weeks to see how it settles. And then we reflect in our review stage on what we could do differently to improve it. And then in our review, we ask, have we identified the root causes for any other problems, or the problem that we were trying to fix, is that we've got the right root cause? Have we encountered any benefits? So not just in terms of money saving, but also perhaps it's an easier process for staff to follow, or easier or better for our service users. Have you shared your learning with colleagues in the wider business? Because that's the best way we find to really spread the message around good improvements. And most importantly, if it worked, celebrating our successes. And if it didn't, go round again until we can. So that's our improvement cycle. I mentioned before about having effective ways to communicate, and one of the ways that we do that is through what we call TIBs. So TIBs are walls in court offices where we share information that is available to staff. It's usually in a really accessible place so that everybody sees it every day. And we point out to managers what's changed on the TIBs so that we can make sure that people are aware and talking about it in meetings. It's written in such a way that it's quick to understand, it's not verbose, it's usually just a snippet of information that can be backed up by other material like the desk aids, as I mentioned before. There's also the opportunity there to write down any issues with the changes and to log progress against how we're testing it. And it allows teams to celebrate their successes and means that it's for everybody involved in the process, not just specifically the people who might be changing the way they work. And that creates much better visibility and awareness for everybody. And that we find means that a process is more likely to embed when everybody is bought into it, not just the specific people who might be directly affected. So, as you know, we're also building a common platform, which is an enabler for all our processes. And I talked to you about our cycle for understanding the current state, the future state, so our ambition, and then interim states to get there. So again, that kind of Carter model, if you're familiar with that. And that's how we deliver the system to align with that as well. So we'll know that we've got a big piece of functionality coming, and our processes that we've designed will align to that end state, and those two will match. But we often deliver functionality incrementally, so we don't just deliver one big drop of functionality. We will deliver what we call a minimum viable product and then build on that with enhanced functionality, often as a result of feedback from staff. And so we make sure that our processes are fully aligned to that. So as we deliver the minimum viable product, we deliver a process to go with it. And that might include some manual workarounds where we haven't delivered the full product yet, and we know we haven't. So we call those our transitional processes, and they are manual, and we do measure the success of those and the disbenefits of them, because they're likely to take more time than the end state, possibly even more time than the current state, while we transition from a legacy system to the new one with an interim state. And we ensure that our processes at every state that we deliver new functionality, we have a process that's aligned to that, so staff are really clear about exactly what it is they need to do and how they need to do it. So that's the end of my presentation. I know that I expect that you've got some questions for me, but I've also got some questions for you, and I'd be really interested to know the answer to these, either by dropping comments into the question and answer sheet, or by contacting us on the email address that we'll give you at the end. I'd really like to know from you what you think we could do better. So what improvements could we make to our processes? What could we do better to meet the needs of you as our users? And now over to you for your questions.
Thank you, Jane, for that presentation. So we're now going to have some questions. You can continue to post these in the Q&A function. So first question for Jane is, you mentioned good process design. Who signs that off? Who signs off that process is good and has been applied and is robust?
Okay, so two things there, I think. One is about how do we make sure it's robust, and I think that's through the involvement of particularly crime ops forum, as I mentioned, making sure and that kind of real rinsing and testing of a process improvement before we roll it out further. So by the time we roll it out nationally, we should know if it's robust, and if it's not, we should know what we're doing about it before we roll it out. So that's the robustness question. But in terms of who signs it off, I, as the service owner, am responsible for that. But I am the service owner for crime reform, and there's also a service owner for the crime service. So although it's my responsibility to sign those processes off, I involve Daniel Flurry really closely in that process to make sure that he is bought into what we're doing as well, so that when he inherits the crime service or the reformed crime service from me at the end of the programme, he understands what it is that he's inheriting. We've got, so it's not just a case of me and Daniel sat in a room and agreeing to sign things off. We've actually got the crime reform service board that I mentioned earlier, and that's the board that's responsible for approving the final standard operating procedures, and the processes flow from that. So we've got quite a good robust sign-off process there, and it's that board alongside the service board that monitors performance and identifies if there have been any issues with those processes, so that adds to the robustness. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Has COVID delayed your improvement plans, and if so, have any areas of improvement been shelved or revised?
So yeah, COVID has had an impact, not so much around the process improvements though. We have had to take care around just the capacity and the mental capacity of our staff to cope with the volume of change that we're rolling out, as well as COVID and everything that came with it. A lot of our staff were still working in courts during COVID, and we were sensitive to the fact that we didn't want to be overwhelming them with a great deal of change at that point, especially because our schedule for rolling out the common platform wasn't paused during COVID. So there were inevitable delays there. I think the main change as a result of COVID, though, was actually just adapting our processes to work for remote hearings. So I know that's something that people a lot of people watched the presentation on that yesterday from one of my colleagues. So we always had a plan to change the process around remote hearings. That was always within scope of the HMCTS reform programme. But when COVID hit, we realised that we needed to respond more quickly to that. And so we quickly rolled out the cloud video platform as an interim product, and that really helped us, as I mentioned yesterday, for anybody who was on that the session about improving the crime service through technology. It really helped us to understand exactly what our requirements were, because we had already rolled out a product that wasn't our MVP for the video hearing service. It was a different product that just met our immediate needs right there and then. But we learned a lot about how to implement products and processes that align with them, and about the needs of our users in relation to those products. So it was a real learning experience for us, and although COVID was a terrible period for everybody, we learned a lot from it that we've now wrapped into our processes for the reform programme.
Is there an end date for crime reform, or do you envisage it being a continual process?
So both is the answer. There is an end date, March 2023. The crime reform programme will close. We will have completed evaluation and handed over everything to the crime live services team and to the to our IT teams. But after that, we will have we will continue with the continuous improvements that have been going on for quite some time now. Continuous improvements was a programme before the crime reform programme. And is flowing through it and will come out the other end. It's something that we consider doesn't have an end date. We should always be striving to achieve the best processes for our users, and things do change, and we need to be alive to that and ready to make changes whenever we need to.
Thank you. And what's been the most challenging part of this project?
The most challenging part of the project, gosh, that's a good question. I mean, so responding to COVID and tackling that, I think it's the volume of courts, the volume of local variation in our processes. We've got over 200 courts. Those all have local variation, local processes. Many of those are needed, and we need to recognise that. So I talked before about having a framework that flexes. So it's not a case of everybody doing something differently, but if we have the right technological enablers and the right high-level processes that people work within, and everybody understands the kind of optimised process that we've designed and tested and rolled out. If national variation, if local variation happens for local reasons because it needs to, we need to be sensitive to that and not try and get everybody performing in exactly the same way, because that doesn't work. But that does make it a challenge to design that high level process that works for everybody, that they can then flex within. I think that's probably the biggest challenge, and of course just capacity to receive change, and we're really sensitive to that. We've got a really fixed timescale on crime reform. We've got a fixed amount of money to spend, and so there's a risk that we try and do too much in the short time that we've got and overwhelm our staff. So I think that would be the other. So those are the two challenges I think for us, putting COVID to one side, is the capacity of our staff to receive the change and the variation across the country.
Thank you. And what do you see as the pros and cons of this, and what do you see as the benefits to those with a disability?
Okay, so pros and cons of continuous improvements. So the cons would be, as I said, the impact on staff and users. Continuously changing the way you work is stressful and hard to adjust to. And if you're a user of the service, continuously having to adapt to changing processes is really hard. That's definitely a con that we need to be alive to. With continuous improvements, though, if we get it right, particularly post-reform, you should find that the changes are incremental and often kind of common sense and designed by the users. So we try to mitigate that risk. In terms of the pros, though, processes that work for everybody and aren't antiquated and stuck in the past, processes that our staff are bought into and understand, and our users can understand, I think is the driver for this. And sorry, could you repeat the second part of the question about people with disabilities?
Yeah, what do you see as the benefits to those with a disability?
Well, I suppose it's about everything that we do is about understanding our users' needs, and that's all our users. So where we have users with disabilities, we need to adapt to those as well. There's a lot of work that goes into making reasonable adjustments for our users. So I mean, there are some really obvious ones, like making sure that we've booked people into the right courts that are accessible. We've got hearing loops in courts so that people can use them. That we provide information in accessible formats for people. So a lot of work goes into the reasonable adjustments that we can make for people with disabilities, and that does link into our continuous improvements processes to make sure that those are understood. We do quality impact assessments for the changes that we make to make sure that any changes don't have a detrimental effect and, if possible, have a positive impact on all our users, including those with disabilities.
And following on for that, how can we ensure that remote hearings meet the the needs of users with a disability?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So we've got a working group specifically looking at that, made up of people from not just HMCTS, but across the criminal justice system, looking at all of the impacts of remote hearings to make sure, again, that the impact on individuals is understood, and that's one of the pieces of work that we're doing as part of that project before we roll out, making sure that that we improve the service for those individuals and certainly don't make it worse.
And I've had a question here that I'm not quite sure of, so I'm hoping you will be. It's how does sentencing remark and case management system work?
Sentencing remark and case management system.
Yeah.
I don't know those. So the case management system is a CPS product. So I'm not involved in how that works, and I don't know what sentencing remark refers to. Sorry. It's not a term that we use in crime reform or in the crime service. If the person who had that question wants to get in touch with us and have a chat, it might be just a language issue, and I can answer that question once I understand the terms that you're using.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of our questions.
Excellent.
So thank you, Jane, for that really interesting session, and thanks to all of those who joined and asked questions. Please don't forget that we have a Q&A panel closing the event. If you want to submit a question in advance, email changesomethingthatmatters@justice.gov.uk.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody.